I make no apologies for the title. This is a frank video looking at the risks of cycling. Because a lot of people I know are scared when riding, or too scared to even contemplate riding. But is that fear misplaced? Have we got it wrong? Because the reality is that perhaps we shouldn't be afraid of cycling. We should be afraid of driving. Let me explain. By looking at what's actually happening out on the roads, by looking at collisions and crashes and at long-term health outcomes, we can see that the picture is very different to what people think. How afraid of flying are you on a scale of 1 to 10?
Probably around a 5.
Okay, and what about driving?
0, quite happy driving.
So how scared are you guys of flying on a scale of 1 to 10?
Scared of flying.
And what about driving, again, out of 10?
Probably a 5.
I spoke with quite a number of people, and it seems that a significant proportion are indeed afraid of flying. And while people were more scared of driving than I expected, it was significantly lower. And as for cycling? And what about cycling? If I asked you to cycle through Bath?
No.
10.
Maybe 4 on the scale.
Okay, all right, so you'd be a little bit more anxious about cycling compared to other things?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Here's something to think about, though. So according to the international research and data analysis company YouGov, 21% of British people have arachnophobia, an extreme fear of spiders. Now this is despite us not having any remotely poisonous spiders, let alone ones that can kill you. In Australia, though, a land full of spiders who can kill you, only 5% of people have arachnophobia. Now, to me, this illustrates that fear can be irrational. British people do not need to fear spiders, but do. Australians, blooming well, should fear spiders, but don't. Now, how does this relate to transport, though? We heard on the street that a lot of people have a fear of flying. According to the International Civil Aviation Organization, up to 40% of people do. Meanwhile, the fear of driving is half that. And yet, if you look at the statistics, driving is significantly more dangerous than flying, both in sheer numbers and also per mile traveled. And what then about cycling? Well, when you look at the statistics, they're pretty scary. So per billion miles travelled here in the UK, 3 people on average are killed whilst driving, compared to 24 people who are killed whilst cycling. In the USA, it's 13.3 people killed whilst driving, compared to 55 people killed whilst cycling. And even in the Netherlands, the global utopia of cycling, with more miles of bike path per capita than anywhere else on the planet, 25 people are killed while cycling per billion miles, compared to just 2.9 people killed whilst driving. However, these statistics don't tell the whole story. Firstly, let's look at how those deaths are reported. So the total numbers are hard to compare due to the different amounts of people who drive versus cycle. So to equal it out, or at least try to, and enable some kind of comparison, they're often reported instead as deaths per billion miles travelled. But it feels to me like there is a flaw in comparing billion vehicle miles as well, because surely, as cyclists, we're slower. So to reach 1 billion miles would take, 5, even 6 times longer. And it's not the distance that exposes us to risk per se, but the time on the road. In the same way that air travel results in 0.003 deaths per billion miles, aeroplanes travel 15 or 20 times faster than cars, and so people travel further, which again skews the safety statistics in their favour. Now, if we adjust that billion miles travelled to equal out time on the road, what would it do to the cycling statistics? Well, here in the UK, if we say that bikes are 5 times slower than cars, and we divide the number of fatalities per billion miles by that amount, we get slightly less than 5 fatalities from cycling, as opposed to 24. Now, it is still more than driving, which is 3, remember, but it is a much smaller difference. In the USA, however, we're now looking at 11 fatalities from cycling, as opposed to 13.3 in cars. And what about the Netherlands? Well, their figures for cycling risk are so high that they have given their government something to think about. Now, some people there are pointing to the low numbers of helmet use, which is an opinion you would struggle to find statistics to back up, but that is perhaps a topic for another day. Most striking, though, is the stat that 38% of those cycling fatalities actually involved no other vehicle at all. And at the same time, it's also worth noting that the pedestrian fatalities in the Netherlands are nearly 3 times lower than the European average, which is something that anti-cyclists should be aware of, given how dangerous some people perceive bikes to be. So far then, we've heard that people are often scared of things that they don't need to be scared of. We've also seen that the dangers of cycling are perhaps not quite as acute as they might first appear, or at least the statistics can be misleading. But by far and away, the most compelling fact, and one that might take a while for you to get your head around, is that the health benefits of cycling are so profound that over an 18-year period, someone who just cycles to work and back has a near 50% lower risk of dying of anything than someone who drives. To explain more, I'm speaking to Bruce Whyte, who led a detailed piece of research into the health outcomes of 82,000 people observed over an 18-year period. Mr. Whyte and his colleagues found that compared with non-active commuters, cyclists had a 20% lower risk of receiving a mental health-related prescription, a 24% lower risk of cardiovascular disease hospitalisation, a 30% lower risk of receiving a cardiovascular disease-related prescription, 24% lower risk of cancer hospitalisation, and a 51% lower risk of cancer death. Most importantly of all, though, they had a 47% lower risk of death from any cause, including road traffic accidents.
We looked at both, it was a commuting question from the census, so it basically asks you how do you get to house, what's your usual method of travel to work. And what we did was we compared people who cycle to work with people who walk to work with everyone else. So everyone else was people who travel by car, which is the majority of people, but also people who use public transport as their main mode of travel. So we were wanting to see what the impacts were for walking and for cycling to work. And what we found was that over this period of 18 years of follow-up, there was much better health outcomes for all-cause mortality, basically people dying for any causes, for cycling, better outcomes for any type of hospitalisation, lower cardiovascular disease, hospitalisation mortality, lower cancer mortality, and lower prescriptions for drugs for anxiety and depression among cyclists. And we had similar, probably not as strong results for walking as well. So walking had positive outcomes, not quite as strong as cycling though.
Do you know then from the results whether or not it's the commuting that has provided these health benefits, or is it that people who are more likely to choose to cycle to work might already have other circumstances in their life? I don't know, maybe like their diet is better, or they do other kind of exercise in the week. I mean, how can we separate that out?
It's a really good question, and we can't really, and that's a weakness in the study. And when you write these studies, that's one of the things we pointed out. Essentially, what we know about people is from what's collected at the census, and the census question is purely about how do you get to work. It's not about your general level of physical activity in other parts of life. There are other studies like this that have shown similar results, though. Biobank study, there's been studies of commuting using biobank data, which does ask those questions, and you do see the same sorts of benefits, maybe not quite as high as what we showed for cycling. We can't separate out the fact that people might be doing other things in their life. It's a wee bit like chicken and egg. Do you know, if you're healthier, you're more likely to be able to cycle and walk. On the other hand, people who walk and cycle to work, it might mean that they do other things as well. That means that they're more likely to do sport or whatever. So it's very, very difficult to separate out. What we did do, though, essentially controlled for anyone who'd been in hospital for cancer, cardiovascular disease, or a mental health diagnosis. So we took them out. Essentially, their impact was taken out. So that, in a sense, gets rid of the people that we would be comparing to who might have been ill already and who probably couldn't have walked or cycled. So we've tried to control for this as much as we could.
That's really cool, isn't it? One of the most important aspects of the results for me was this all-cause mortality risk. Because I'm fascinated to know that, does it take into account the risks of cycling itself? Presumably it does.
It does, yeah. So one of our results, and you can see this in the paper, is that we show that people who cycled to work had twice the likelihood of being hospitalised after a road traffic collision. So overall, that's in the all-cause mortality. So the all-cause mortality takes account of that and shows that there's still a massive health benefit from walking and cycling.
Bruce Whyte has completed another piece of research which estimates the size of the health benefits in economic terms of active transport to Scotland as it stands today. You know how much that 47% reduced risk is worth? 0.75 billion euros. Now, in a population of 5 million, that's pretty significant. The fact that driving to work is less safe than cycling is going to be lost on most people because we feel safe in our cars. They're designed to insulate us from the world around us, including catastrophic accidents. But the reality is that if driving forms part of a sedentary lifestyle, then actually, whilst you may have a slightly lower risk of dying in a road traffic accident, you are going to be accelerating your demise in other areas, literally sitting yourself to death. And actually, it's not just the inactivity either. There's a raft of evidence out there that shows that air pollution is worse inside a car compared to outside. And that's air pollution that can trigger a whole raft of health issues, cardiovascular disease being one of them, not just for you as the driver, but also for your passengers. It's particularly bad for kids. Some people might point to what many consider to be a victim-blaming culture that makes sure cyclists wear high-vis and helmets so that we can protect ourselves from the dangers of cars, which makes cycling seem less safe because you don't need to wear high-vis or a helmet in a car, do you? Some people point to a lack of segregated cycling infrastructure. The sharing roads with cars and heavy vehicles feels intimidating. The sheer size, weight and power of motor vehicles means that they do feel threatening, and you don't need much imagination to picture what might happen if things go wrong. And some people point to levels of mobile phone use while driving, and certainly it is disconcerting to be riding along fully aware that the person driving towards you is not looking at you or the road ahead, but instead at a phone screen. I think it's a combination of all of these factors, but also the peculiar way in which the media fixate on cycling-related incidents and report them more frequently than other vehicles. Of course, what we see in the media is more often than not a direct result of what the majority of people actually choose to read, so this is perhaps just a reflection of cyclist deaths being of interest because they're maybe less common. However, it could also be because of how the media choose to report it. So one fascinating piece of research from here in the UK from Fevier and Aldred analysed newspaper articles and found stark trends around reporting style. They said that narratives tend to erase driver agency in collisions while highlighting agency for cyclists, and pedestrian deaths just appear as isolated incidents rather than as part of a wider structural pattern. Basically, cars are responsible for crashes, not drivers, unless the driver has gone rogue. Cyclists, meanwhile, are almost always referenced, but of most interest to us now, though, was that the articles examined often reported cyclist deaths with reference to other recent cyclist deaths, suggesting that they're part of a pattern and implying greater frequency of events. Basically, making it seem worse than it is. And the same is true across the world. So similar research has found similar things in the USA, in Canada, in Australia, and beyond. It's a result of motonormativity, a societal blindness to cars. But aspects of the cycling media can also be guilty of fanning the flames. One British website now boasts 920 posts to its near miss of the day feature. Now, they say that it highlights poor driving standards. I'd argue that it's fear-mongering. Why? Because we know that cycling is not as dangerous as it first looks. We know that it is, in fact, safer long-term than driving. And we also know why it doesn't always feel this way. But what, though, about the elephant in the room? Because we're not actually talking about statistics here, are we? We're talking about real people dying. And while it's easy to be dispassionate about numbers, every one of those deaths is a tragedy. So in some countries, like here in the UK, cycling is safer now than it has been in years. And yet still, lives are wasted on the roads. In the USA, the statistics have worsened every year since 2010. Clearly, work still needs to be done to make the roads safer. However, I passionately believe that the biggest threat to health is from our own perception of danger. Get more people on bikes and they should live happier, healthier, longer lives. Now, that's not to diminish the fear of cycling, because roads can be intimidating and very scary places. But I'm struck again by that analogy of people with a phobia of spiders. The fact that phobias are 4 times higher in a country with no poisonous spiders than one with them makes me feel that if we can actually just get people out on bikes, it can only help to solve more of these issues. Now, I appreciate this is a really difficult topic and it has been a frank discussion, but I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts. So please get involved in the comment section down below. Do you believe that the risks of cycling are overblown? Or actually, do you think that I'm perhaps underplaying it here in this video? Get involved in the comment section. Very much look forward to reading them.